There are books that are banned because they offend a government, and there are books that are banned because they threaten a religion. But once in a very long while, a book is banned for a far more disturbing reason. Because it exposes something about human nature that society is not prepared to face. And 120 Days of Sodom belongs to that rare category. Not suppressed because it lies, but because it refuses to lie at all. This manuscript was not written to be read aloud in salons or debated in polite circles. It was written in confinement, in silence, under the constant awareness that the author might die before anyone ever saw a single word. And that urgency seeps into every line like rot through wood. Readers often say this book is obscene, violent, inhuman. But those words are evasions, because what truly unsettles is not what happens on the page. It is the cold, methodical calm with which it happens. The absence of passion, the absence of chaos. The way cruelty becomes routine, scheduled, almost bureaucratic, as if evil itself has learned to keep records. Many who open this book believe they are about to witness excess, something exaggerated and unreal. But what they encounter instead is something far worse. A mirror held up not to monsters, but to systems, to power, to the quiet agreement that when no one is watching, anything can be justified. This is not a story meant to arouse or entertain. It is a descent, slow and suffocating, into a sealed world where empathy is treated as a flaw, where suffering is reduced to data, and where the most terrifying realization arrives not through screams, but through silence. Because the violence does not explode. It continues, calmly, efficiently, without interruption. This book was hidden because it suggested a thought too dangerous to publish alive. That when authority is absolute and consequence disappears, cruelty does not look wild or impulsive. It looks organized, rational, and disturbingly human. The origin of this book matters because it explains everything that follows. It was written not in freedom, but in a cell, by a man who knew what it meant to be erased by the state, watched, controlled, and silenced, and who responded not with repentance, but with creation. The manuscript was composed on narrow strips of paper, glued end to end into a single fragile scroll, small enough to hide, small enough to survive a sudden search, because the author understood that discovery would mean destruction, not just of the work, but of its right to exist at all. There was no audience in mind, no market, no hope of publication, only the compulsion to record a vision of power stripped of pretense, power without virtue, without restraint, without justification. This context is crucial, because the book does not beg for approval, it does not seek understanding, it does not explain itself. It assumes that the reader has already crossed a line simply by choosing to continue. The world inside the manuscript is enclosed, isolated from law, morality, and consequence. A deliberate construction designed to answer a single question. What happens when men who already possess wealth and authority are placed beyond accountability entirely? What emerges is not madness, but structure. Not chaos, but order. Schedules, routines, roles assigned and enforced, as if suffering itself must obey a timetable. There is no moral struggle here, no internal conflict, because the system does not allow it. And that is precisely what makes it unbearable to read. The absence of resistance. The way domination becomes normalized through repetition. As the author writes, you can feel the pressure of confinement shaping the prose. The sense that this is not fantasy spilling outward, but something excavated inward, pulled from observation, resentment, and a ruthless clarity about how institutions protect those who design the rules. The cell is never named, but it is everywhere, in the sealed rooms of the story, in the isolation of its victims, in the certainty that no outside force will intervene. And as the narrative begins to unfold, the reader realizes that the most disturbing element is not what is done, but how calmly it is allowed to continue, as if the world beyond the walls has already agreed to look away. What unfolds next is not escalation in the way readers expect. There is no sudden plunge into frenzy, no dramatic collapse into madness. Instead, there is administration, planning, rules written and enforced with a precision that feels almost familiar. And that familiarity is what tightens the chest. The men at the center of the story are not driven by impulse. They are driven by entitlement, by the certainty that their position places them beyond consequence. And so the violence becomes procedural, catalogued, repeated, refined, as if cruelty itself is being optimized. This is where the book becomes hardest to endure, not because of shock, but because of repetition. The steady rhythm of domination that erodes any illusion of exception or mercy. Suffering is no longer an event. It is a condition, expected, normalized, stripped of narrative importance. And in that process, the victims begin to fade, not as people, but as units within a closed system designed to extract obedience. There are moments where the reader searches instinctively for a crack, a flaw, a hesitation, something that might signal collapse. But the structure holds, and that is the point. The author is not interested in catharsis. He is interested in endurance, in showing how systems persist precisely because they do not rely on emotion. The language remains cold, almost indifferent. And that indifference acts like a weight, pressing down on the reader, forcing an uncomfortable realization that horror does not require passion. It only requires permission. As this sealed world continues to function, the question shifts subtly. It is no longer about what these men do, but about what allows them to continue doing it. And the answer is implied with terrifying clarity. Silence, complicity, and the absence of oversight. The book does not shout this accusation. It lets it accumulate, page after page, until the reader understands that outrage is irrelevant here, because outrage changes nothing inside a system built to ignore it. At this point, many readers attempt to retreat, to dismiss the work as excess, as provocation for its own sake. But that retreat is precisely what the book resists. Because beneath the brutality lies a deliberate philosophy, articulated without apology. The men who rule this enclosed world speak not as villains, but as theorists, explaining, justifying, reducing human experience to appetite and utility, stripping morality down to an inconvenience invented by the weak. This is where the book crosses a line that few others dare to approach. It does not merely depict cruelty, it rationalizes it, not through passion, but through logic. And that logic is chillingly coherent. The author, Marquis de Sade, does not argue that his characters are right. He argues that their worldview already exists, embedded in hierarchies, protected by wealth, and sustained by indifference. And he dares the reader to deny it. There is no comforting distance here, no framing device to reassure us that this is aberration rather than extension. Instead, the philosophy seeps outward, suggesting that what happens in isolation is only a concentrated form of what happens everywhere power goes unchecked. As the narrative deepens, The violence almost recedes into the background, not because it lessens, but because the ideas begin to dominate. Ideas about ownership, control, and the reduction of people into resources. And it becomes clear that the true obscenity of the book is not what it shows, but what it explains. The discomfort sharpens as the reader recognizes fragments of these arguments echoed in real histories, in real institutions, in moments where suffering was justified by efficiency, progress, or necessity. And the realization lands quietly but forcefully that the book is not asking to be forgiven, it is asking to be acknowledged. By the end of this section, the reader is no longer simply witnessing a story. They are being confronted with a framework, one that insists the line between civilization and barbarity is thinner and far more negotiable than we like to believe. By the time the book reaches its later stages, something subtle but irreversible has happened to the reader. Shock has faded, disgust has dulled, and what remains is a colder, heavier sensation. Recognition. This is the moment where the book becomes truly dangerous, because it no longer relies on extremity to disturb. It relies on clarity. The structure holds to the end. The routines continue, the hierarchy remains intact, and there is no collapse that would allow the reader to feel relief, no moral reckoning delivered by fate or chance, because the author refuses to grant that comfort. This is why the manuscript could not be tolerated, not because it was graphic, but because it denied society its favorite lie, that cruelty always destroys itself, that excess inevitably leads to downfall. Here, power persists precisely because it is insulated, because it is designed to absorb outrage and render it meaningless. The world outside the book recognized this implication immediately, even if it refused to articulate it, because to allow the book to circulate freely would mean admitting that civilization is not undone by monsters, but maintained by systems willing to trade humanity for order. Suppression was the only available response. To declare the work unpublishable, unthinkable, unfit for survival, as if destroying the text could erase the question it posed. The manuscript was hidden, lost, presumed destroyed, and in that disappearance, the world tried to reassure itself that some ideas are too extreme to endure. But the irony is inescapable. The very effort to erase the book confirmed its central argument, that power decides what may exist and what must be buried. The longer it remained unseen, the more mythic it became, not as a work of art, but as a forbidden object, a thing that had crossed a boundary language was not supposed to cross. And yet, even in absence, the book continued to exert pressure, because what it described was not an anomaly, but an exaggeration of patterns history kept repeating. Sealed rooms, unchecked authority, suffering rationalized as necessity. The attempt to destroy the book was never really about protecting readers. It was about protecting the illusion that such systems are rare, accidental, or confined to fiction. When the manuscript finally resurfaced and entered the world it had been denied, it did not arrive as a relic to be admired, but as a test, and many who encountered it failed that test immediately, either by condemning it outright or by consuming it for the wrong reasons, both reactions equally avoidant. The book does not ask to be liked, and it certainly does not ask to be excused. It asks something far more uncomfortable: to be read without escape, without the safety of moral distance. This is why it remains difficult even now, long after the walls that contained it have crumbled, because modern readers are still tempted to believe that awareness alone is a safeguard, that naming cruelty somehow neutralizes it. But the book offers no such reassurance. It survives precisely because it does not resolve. It does not teach redemption. It does not promise progress. Its endurance is unsettling because it suggests that the conditions it describes have not vanished. They have only changed form, relocated, disguised behind language that sounds reasonable, administrative, necessary. To read this book today is to feel that quiet pressure again, the sense that you are not witnessing something foreign, but something concentrated, distilled to its most honest shape. That is why it continues to provoke calls for censorship, even in an age that prides itself on openness. Because beneath every argument about obscenity lies a deeper fear, the fear that the book is not exaggerating nearly as much as we would like. The final disturbance it leaves behind is not revulsion, but doubt. Doubt about where the real boundary lies between fiction and reflection, and whether the impulse to ban, to silence, to declare something unfit for existence is itself part of the same mechanism the book exposes. The work survives not as entertainment, but as a reminder that some texts are dangerous not because they corrupt, but because they refuse to comfort. And that once such an idea is written, even if it is hidden, rolled into a fragile scroll and buried in stone, it does not disappear. It waits until someone is willing to look at it and realize that the most frightening thing it contains is not violence, but recognition.